Welcome to the Veritas Podcast, where we explore heterodox thoughts on politics, sex and culture with an exciting lineup of guests. I am your host, Dr. Petra Bueskens, and I'll be asking guests, what is it that distinguishes this political and cultural moment? Why isn't the world making sense anymore? What is reality in an algorithmically driven world? How can we regenerate our psyches and societies?
So lovely to meet you, Kate, in person, digitally, whatever that is now. So thank you for the amazing work you do in this space. It's been wonderful to discover you actually through you listening to me on a podcast and then reaching out. And then now I've done a deep dive into your work, which is prodigious. I mean, you've done so much from the get-go. So first up, thank you for all your fantastic work. And I thought I'd just read your bio briefly and then we can get into the conversation. Kate has an honours degree in social ecology. She went on to train in psychoanalytic psychotherapy. Kate worked in welfare and community development for over 2 decades. The COVID mandates pushed Kate out of the welfare industry, whereupon she started researching government, corporate and global policy bodies, plans and their repercussions. Her main focus areas have been the wealth transfer resulting from the COVID policies, the social impact bond landscape, managed retreat policies, what is happening to our food systems, digital ID, and other aspects of the fourth industrial revolution. Well, that just about covers it all, doesn't it? So I thought today, because if we keep it to sort of an hour and a half, maybe we just do 2 now. Like we can go further if we need to. But in terms of my own research into your work, I thought we could focus on social impact bonds and managed retreat this time. And if you're open to it, we do a second one on digital ID and some of the other issues around food and surveillance, because it strikes me that there's a common theme through all of them, which is the commodification of misery, to put it in another word, or the commodification of nature, or the commodification of privacy. So the common theme, which has interested me philosophically, you're looking at the coalface, like what is happening and what is the transformation of policy and data. But first up, I wanted, because the human interest angle is always interesting. So I wanted perhaps you to talk a bit about yourself, your history, your working history in the welfare space, but also in psychotherapy, because we've got a lot of overlaps there. And then what happened to you personally with the COVID mandates and leaving your work?
Sure. Yep. Okay. So I started studying. Well, I went into psychotherapy when I was, I think, mid-20s. So I was quite young, and I had two young children, and I needed extra supports. And I didn't believe, even back then, even with no study or anything, I wasn't into the mental health model and the pathologizing model. And I really was lucky enough to find a good, very sort of more old school psychotherapist who helped me understand more about what was going on for myself personally through dreams and analysis. And so that I went from there, and I did my honours degree in social ecology, which is a very sort of broad looking at how systems thinking and how things interact with each other. So not reductionist. And I was interested in communities and how people work together and evolve. And so I was interested in all of that. I was a big hippie. I sort of went and lived up in Nimbin and had home births, and ended up back in the mountains and started studying psychotherapy for many years. I did very in-depth group therapy, individual therapy, toddler observation, infant observation, big dream analysis components.
So you did a classical psychoanalytic training.
Yes.
Well, you did Buddhist, or was that,
And then it had the Tibetan Buddhist psychotherapy running through it. So then it was, going to Tibetan Buddhist teachings and Tibetan Buddhist retreats. So the old, the actual Tibetan Buddhist masters and their teachings and philosophy and learning about that as well. So it had the interlay of both together. I think I studied that for about 13 years. And then I worked as a welfare worker. So I didn't really work in psychotherapy too much. I worked in welfare and I did many different things in welfare. So worked with young women, domestic violence work, drug and everything basically. Mostly kept myself in work where it wasn't too prescriptive. I somehow managed to find the non-prescriptive jobs. So I was having to do, I did a little bit of prescriptive stuff for juvenile justice and a few other government jobs, but mostly I was just able to work with people. And I was very, very suspicious on the mental health. That was all coming in really strongly that time because it didn't have its hooks in so much. So I'm talking about 20 years ago. So I've sort of seen how mental health has sort of, come in and then really everyone's looked at as just having mental health issues and then pathologized in that certain way and treated as though they've just got a mental health issue and they've just got anxiety or they've just got depression. And I never wanted to work like that. I always wanted to sit with people and find out what was going on in their lives and how I could be of assistance in some way or another, how more understanding of your own situations and what's going on for you. I always work with people like that. So,
Which is actually therapeutic, of course, the what now called exploratory model, but that is therapy and the transference relationship, or even just knock out the word transference. The relationship is both the container within which healing takes place, but also the animate living quality that makes it possible. Yeah.
absolutely. And that's not transferable from one worker to another, just like it's some sort of Lego, this is the way welfare's treated, more and more. It's just that the relationship and the trust and the actual long-term build-up that's absolutely essential for any real deep change isn't seen as very important. It's just,
And the idea that people are unique. So the therapist and the person coming to therapy are both unique. And so the dynamic they create is fundamentally unique. I was going
absolutely.
to say the analyst and, but I didn't think that was a standard term. But yeah, the idea that people are unique seems also in some ways to be passé.
Yeah, and when at one point worked as a children and parenting program coordinator, and I was working in childcare centres. This was about maybe 5, 6, 8 years ago, and I became very alarmed at seeing the amount of 2 and 3-year-olds that were medicated. ADD and oppositional defiance disorder, and just that was really alarming to me to see how much children are being medicated and diagnosed from very young ages.
Me
And
too.
yeah, and seeing how children are very, pretty much exhausted and families are really exhausted. And there's just a lot that's not factored into children's behavior or why families are struggling the way they are. And it's just taken to this very, very simplistic, very cruel, just an internal, there's something wrong with you, you need to be medicated or pathologized in some way rather than looking at the bigger picture of what's happening.
Yeah. There's no social or sociological insight. It's interesting because there's an imposition of collectivist solutions, so an eradication of the individual and sovereignty. On the other hand, there's no recognition of the way in which it's socially produced. That's the worst of both worlds.
Yeah, that's really true.
Mm.
Yeah, really true. And it's just a green light to be able to enact horrendous policies and then to blame the individual, like what
Yeah.
you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. And same with mental health. Even the terminology we use, mental health, it's so truncated. It's like it's a token itself. And it is.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. So I don't want to jump around too much, but when the mandates were in, the COVID mandates, and started to see the World Health Organization talking about the mental health toll from COVID, and I was really alarmed. I was like, oh, mental health is going to be really misused.
Yes.
Yeah, just sort of saw that early on that was going to be really big in terms of what happens. And of course, that's happened, but that gets me into the social impact bond markets and everything else. But so I won't go there right this second.
Yeah.
I was working in community development, so I got more and more into community development, and always just worked with the community. I always thought the community was really important in terms of just people who live in a neighbourhood and what they think is important, and you build up the relationships and everything else within the area. And when it wasn't the mandates yet, but I could see that they were coming. And I was, in meetings with Department of Health and everything else. And there was just a number of things for me. Firstly, I guess for myself personally, I've always treated myself naturally. So a lot of Chinese medicine and natural health, and I put a lot of money into that. It's actually a lot more work and a lot more responsibility than people who generally just going to a doctor and getting prescriptions. So I didn't like any of the messaging that was coming through around that time about people, needing to be responsible for your health and needing to be responsible for your community. I think I always considered myself a person who was quite, considerate of other people within my community or other people, the environment and other people. And to sort of have a whole bunch of people who I knew didn't really ever sort of, I was always very active in the space of the environment and social issues. And to see a lot of people starting to tell me what I needed to do that I, was very aware had never really taken a stance through their whole lives around really anything was concerning to me. And the way that the vitriol and the level of us versus them, and you couldn't ask any questions really early on, and you were sort of treated incredibly. It was actually very frightening for anyone who was questioning. I think for most people, it was very frightening because of the vitriol that was unleashed upon you straight away.
Yeah, I felt it. And then if you went covert, it felt bizarre and odd, like you were at once removed from your society, fighting who you are.
Yeah, absolutely. So that all just, and the pressure and then the knowing it's coming and everything else. So I sort of bounced out and got into a different job thinking I might be a little bit more protected there. And then,
Sorry, what do you mean knowing it's coming? Were you afraid of the vaccine or?
no, the mandates. You could feel that they were going to come.
Yes.
So,
yeah, I agree.
Yeah, the mandates were going to come. And so I jumped out of my job at the time to another job where I thought I might be a Catholic organization that I thought might be a little bit more hesitant to mandate, and they weren't going to mandate at that point. But then they mandated within about 2 months of me being there. So I was fired at that for non-vaccination at that point. And
Terrible, absolutely terrible. Did you make a statement about that to them? As in, did you complain?
because they all did, all the organizations in welfare, and I'm sure it was everywhere else, they put out the surveys. How do you feel about working with a non-vaccinated person? These sorts of very leading questions. So they could get the okay and tick from the staff, to protect themselves basically. So all of that was coming. So I pushed back with, the things I was finding out at the time about the concerns around the vaccination and around children, because I was working at that point out of foster care. And so they were really pushing the vaccines on the foster care children as well. So I put stuff in there about the concerns for children with with this injection. Then I didn't really get anything back, really. It was just, well, we are concerned about every single person. So, when I put in the stuff about it's really only going to affect the elderly, with comorbidities. Well, we care about every single person, that was a sort of statement back to me, but they don't really care about any effects it could have on small children,
Yeah. Oh, it was a blunt statement, a meaningless propagandized statement, wasn't it? Because it didn't matter about challenging with fact. That's when we knew we were in a kind of cult-like situation or, a mass formation.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So and then I was just fired. They were just doing what they had to do to get. There was only a couple of us that were fired. I was only very new. I hadn't been into the office yet. Because people were still working from home. But as far as I'm aware, in a big organization, there's only two of us in my area. So I actually always thought that there was only maybe 5% of the population who said no and stood up.
I think it's smaller than the 30% that's put forward. I think I said that in my article. I agree. It was very small. There was one or two in every school, church, choir, work group, but not really a whole lot more.
No.
And it felt different because we found each other. And so then it felt like, there's a community. And I think that then people extrapolate from that. But it looked to me, at least in Australia, it was very, very small. And the other thing that I think is different, having just been in America at a, dissident conference, is that because of our much smaller population, it was harder to find each other and harder to have anyone in the system. and, that was protesting. And the very, very few people that did, there was absolutely no mercy, no matter who you were. So you could have been Michael Lunig, who's a legacy artist, an establishment figure by virtue of being at the age of 40 years, and it didn't matter. He effectively was demoted and then kicked out. And we saw that with the doctors as well. And, the people that weren't visible like yourself, but high profile people were not protected. Whereas I think both the UK and the US, with the libertarian and the classical liberalism, different shades of the same phenomenon, I think protected and rallied around each other. I don't think that happened here.
No, I don't think it happened here either. You're exactly right. It was, even just on being not anybody with a public figure or anything, but it was incredible how quickly you could just be seen in a certain light. It didn't matter, even if you're just talking people who know you personally, known your whole life, what you stand for, the amount of work you've done. Like I did a lot for Tibet, around Tibet and Tibetan refugees, and, always worked and did stuff for the environment. But all of that just doesn't matter. You can just be seen in a certain way very quickly.
Yeah, including, this is why for me, I had to immerse myself in the sort of mass formation material, the psychology of cults, and why I found C.J. Hopkins so compelling, because it included like first degree relatives. And that's when you know you're in the presence of something, because they know you to your core. It included spouses, it included, adult children. And, so I know people on both sides where the parent was confronted by adult children and reverse, adult children rejected by parents. But I think that was indication of that. And also the extent to which the government had fearmongered. So, it really did. But you're right, it ate into the core. But also I think what you're saying, which I certainly observed too, is that I'm going to say this harshly, but more facile or hypocritical people could rise to a little petty dictator, use your actually Jeffrey Tucker called it holy water, that's the way in which hand sanitizer was everywhere, like holy water. But, have your mask on, this sort of, and Australians, I think, have a curious psychology around that, the control and dominance and conformity piece. We're a highly conformist culture despite the myth. So we felt that. I was at a kid's concert and I felt a stare from another parent that was absolutely intense, because I was borderline about whether I should be there or not. And it just, even that, I can't participate,
Yeah.
A school principal demanding I let her know about my vaccination status. And I refused, because that isn't that the principle of the matter.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. I ran for IMOP through the federal election. So that was 2024, which was really interesting because I had to stand up in public forums and talk, in the meet the candidates. So I wasn't just talking to, freedom sort of groups. I was talking to mainstream, and I was so shocked. It was such a big shock to me to see this. I don't know how much percentage, maybe 5 to 10% of the population who would love to tell everyone what to do. They would love to have that control over the rest of us. And that's, I saw really clearly that I don't think it's the main. I think there's a lot of people that just go along to get along.
Agreed.
But I think there are a significant chunk of people who love to have that much control and power over others.
Yeah, I agree. And that, it was like a Rorschach. It revealed that in people's characters. And it, when people say now, I would never have been, a Nazi, or I wouldn't, actually, what this Milgram-like experiment revealed was who was in that, ranging from, as you say, the more passive compliance or ignorant compliance through to really quite active and aggressive control of others. And that can happen in different ways, like also just social ostracism or personal attack or demanding personal content. Like I said to the principal, I wouldn't reveal that any more than I would tell you my gynecological results.
Yeah.
And she was just stunned. But there was just this demand and expectation to reveal personal content. So it also, it empowered people to ask and police inappropriate content. And my sense is, and I think we pick up on this with the social impact investing stuff, is that has categorically changed our society. It's not like, oh, that was just this moment and it's over. that moment was transformative for the West and in Australia radically, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, yeah, I do, and I'd be interested in what way you're talking about. I feel like it completely changed the way I just did not realize what I was really living in. I did not realize how I just that's actually been the most painful and shocking part of it is that you can't really trust people that you thought you could trust, and yeah, and that's actually quite terrifying. That it just takes a threat or a generated threat or a propagandized threat, and people will behave. The gloves are off.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And I think trust because, by virtue of my work in this space as a psychotherapist and working with people who have been suddenly forced into being dissidents, who were just middle of the road people before. Mostly for me, this is around the gender stuff and their children being radicalized. And I work with parents because the law, of course, is so punitive that I don't work with young people, but I probably wouldn't anyway. With therapy, as you know, you've got to work in the space that feels right to you, like writing, you write about what you know. So that it felt more resonant with my existing knowledge base and person to work with parents. But again, this transformation into being a dissident and then the discovery of how you're treated has led to mass loss of trust for those, like you said, it's 5%. But we in the 5%, I mean, I said this in my interview with Melissa, I think we're traumatized. Like, I don't think that's an exaggeration. And those words are exaggerated and overused. Now you're considered traumatized if there's a negative comment under your social media. No, that's not trauma. But when the whole society turns against you and you have rupture in primary relationships and you're not sure if those camps being built might be for you because you don't want to get a vaccine, I think that leads to trauma. And there's no recognition of that either in the wider society or really in our community, because I think we find it hard to talk about. There's a desire for revenge. There's a desire for, I guess the sort of alternative living stuff, which is really important, like let's get outside the system. But I actually think we need to process what happened to us as well and how we ever really mend the breach. And I don't know, because that's very personal content, but if you wanted to share your sense of that for you, because you've flagged the loss of trust, I'd be interested in what your experience is there, if you want to. And we can just cut this out if you don't want to. So, yeah.
Yeah, sure, sure. So I feel, I mean, there was, the fantasies that people had, the fantasy that I remember saying they're going to have to push me on the ground and inject it into my arm, and like, it still makes me almost cry. Like,
Mhm.
you don't have that fantasy unless the threat is there. That threat was there. And I think it's really, it was definitely there with bringing in the military and, a lot of people were saying things like that. And I just think, yeah, so the traumatized, because there's almost now like people who didn't stand up in any way, shape or form have no idea what happened to that 5%.
No idea. No
They're
idea.
not interested really either. So it's not like in all of the work I've done over the last 3 years when I need to understand what's going on in the world, I was caught blindsided. I've never had anyone close to me go, Kate, who I've never had anyone who didn't agree with me when I took my stance say, Kate, why did you feel that way? Or, I'd really like to talk to you more about that or how that felt and what happened to you. Never a single word about it. So it's a very bizarre sort of mad thing
I
that
agree.
what happened to people. And it was so intense, and that you weren't allowed out in public and you were being ostracized and treated like this it was incredibly dangerous and second-class citizen, and the rhetoric was so dangerous. And now it's just like it never really happened, or it wasn't that bad, or the government learnt that, they made some mistakes and they've learnt things. So I guess I sort of took off after, when all of this happened, and I thought I need to understand things. And when I research, I put things out and I just read government documents and I read the United Nations documents and I say, this is what they're saying. This is actually how this is being framed and what they're saying, not just about COVID. Because COVID was just opening the door to the fourth industrial revolution and, to a whole bunch of digital, the digital revolution and everything online and us being completely monitored. It was just the opening up of the door. So I've tried to show what's happening and what they're saying in their documents to be able to, I don't know, maybe just open people's eyes up that thought this was just about COVID and we have to just do this for 1 to 2 years.
Mm.
It hasn't worked.
No.
It has not worked.
No.
And so, yeah, it's very puzzling to me because logic doesn't work.
No, that's right. And I've got two thoughts here about what you just said. One is that there's a moral stain on the body politic, and that's why it's not being discussed. Because as you know, as a, psychoanalytically trained person, the unspeakable, there's, numerous Freudian quotes about this, but when something is in the unspeakable, it's literally unprocessed. So it operates. So the whole point of psychoanalysis or psychotherapy is to make the unconscious conscious. So you have more agency and more sovereignty and more self-awareness and a greater capacity for ethical action. And so this sits in the unconscious of the culture, to use Jung, the collective unconscious, because it's such such an egregious act. And even though many people were well-meaning at the time, very few don't understand it now. And I think the evidence is there because very few people would get boosters. The various surveys that show people no longer have trust in government, the collapse of trust. And so what we can see is that the body politic, let's say the collective of citizens in Australia, know that something very bad happened, but because something like, well, if we're right, something like 95% of people went along with it, they don't want to look at that. And we talk a lot about that in terms of power. So the people with power don't want to look at it because there's potentially criminal offences that were made, not just potentially. But I think that at the psychological level and the social level, they're not processing it either because they persecuted their fellow men and women directly or indirectly. And so there just isn't a conversation about that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's true. And that makes,
There's a taboo. More specifically, there's a taboo, which is different to not talking about it. Yeah.
yeah. And then what is going to happen next, and will people behave any differently if it's wrapped up slightly differently? The powers that be are very good. Like that's what I realized. They understand people a lot more than I do. Like I did not know that people could. So I remember thinking, I can't believe it's this easy to make people do this to each other. I didn't think for whatever reason, I didn't get caught up in the fear campaign around COVID. And I just could not believe how easy it was to make people turn against each other and treat each other so appallingly. So they understand something about people that I personally didn't understand and still struggle with.
Did you read the social psychology? I did as a student, but you still don't. It's very different to read about the Milgram experiment and the prison experiments too. But it's quite another to live it. And what is so, I think, bamboozling for those of us in the, 5% is that there's still no awareness, as you said before, and no responsiveness. Literally there, it's like, what's that word for when something can't absorb water? Anyway, the duck feather, there's no capacity to absorb what we're saying. And I think there's two things I think. One is that there's the cult mentality, and two, there's the paradigm break, which is what I wrote about. And so for people inside the risk culture model, it makes sense and we don't. And they just don't want to look at it, or they think we're propagandized or cookers or whatever the other terms are. And I think we look at that and go, that is a model of the human being and the social and the natural that's absolutely objectionable and unethical, and that never shall the twain meet. And if the media did its job and brought the most articulate, people on both sides, there could be a debate. And I think we'd win that debate because we have the ethical component and they don't. But we're not given the chance. And the only version of our argument that people see is, say, the worst stereotype at one of the protests, or, they're not given a good faith, articulate version of our argument. And so it's a mix of ignorance and fear, it seems to me. But I also think, contrary to many people in our movement, that a lot of people actively sign up for that too, because they no longer have a sense of their own freedom and they are fearful. And so it's that sort of daddy government, mummy medicine stuff, that people actually feel they need. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe if they could get back in touch with their sense of agency, it would be different. But I think the other thing you're saying, which is interesting, is that reason doesn't work. And I see you, and maybe I'm projecting, but as someone who, I have this too, uh, engages in knowledge production and analysis to regulate and understand. So in going into the documents, we went into different kinds of documents. I went more sort of philosophical and you've gone into the government documents, but it's a way of trying to make sense of actually a traumatizing situation.
Yep.
And so that's why I think your work is so compelling, because your work serves as a kind of, a capacity to regulate self and other. And I feel similarly.
Yeah.
It's actually an unusual mindset, I suspect. But I
Yeah.
don't know if that feels like projection or if that resonates.
Well, it resonates in terms of I was hit by the side with the COVID, what they did with COVID. So I think in part I don't want to be hit again like that, just
Mhm.
completely taken unawares. So I
Yep.
was like, I'm going to try and work out what's going on in the world, and I thought, okay, I'll give myself 2022 to understand, and then of course it's like 3 years later. And I'm like, the more you learn, the more you see the amount of enormous networks set up around so many different components of what's coming and what's being constructed at the moment. So I really wanted to know myself. I don't think I do get quite distressed actually when I read and I look at things and I'm like, I can't, like the social impact bond structure. I was hearing Tashi talks because when I was working in welfare and we're getting fired, I banded together with a whole bunch of welfare workers and we wrote testimonials, collected testimonials around how the most vulnerable were being affected by the COVID policies. And they were being affected. That was another thing that really incensed me was, all these white collar workers, sitting at home, just, moving from their office to their home, keeping their good, their well-paid jobs with their backyards and very comfortable homes. And I was working in Department of Housing and just, imagining people being locked down in Department of Housing or the youth centres where young people who really needed those supports, locked
Yeah.
homes, and then putting all the increased pressures on families that were already struggling and at breaking point. And they know, the government knows there's enough bloody papers around talking about, that people need supports and community and relationships to keep them okay. And that, if you take away people's incomes, then it affects, it brings a whole bunch more problems and socioeconomic issues, etc. So I was horrified that the government was doing what they were doing without any with such little accountability.
Mm.
And so we collected all these testimonials and stories about what welfare workers were seeing firsthand and what they were trying to do to be able to see their clients and just to be able to help them. And, and it would have been the most ethical welfare workers, the ones who really went above and beyond, that were actually a lot of them, I would say that was the main people who would have stood up against the COVID stuff. And
Yeah.
they were fired. So we collected heaps of testimonials and wrote sector letters, domestic violence letters from the domestic violence workers, the out of home care, the foster care workers were writing about what they were seeing because foster care kids couldn't see their parents for really long extended periods of time. All these different things we wrote to the government and the ministers responsible for the portfolios and said, basically, how have you risk assessed that COVID is more serious than what you're doing to people and to the most vulnerable?
Yeah.
So, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten where we started this conversation, but
Oh, no, that's all right. I think it's a good segue into the social impact bonds, but I find this
yeah.
really interesting that, you with a whole group of colleagues actually pushing back. What was the reaction?
Yeah. It was when they did respond, it was basically, this isn't our responsibility. It was a lot of just, this came from the state, this came from the federal, this came from the NDIA, like it was just the shoving around of responsibility. And then it just blanket statements about how dangerous COVID was. So there was no reckoning with what they were doing personally. And I think that's appalling that anyone could be in that position and going along with things without fully, being responsible for the portfolio they're meant to be responsible for.
Absolutely. And this, again, is what's come out in this Royal Commission. But there's this kind of farce that this wasn't said. Like, I knew it was said with the doctors, but as you said, maybe before we were recording about there was no traction for the welfare workers. It's interesting to hear this story because it seems that in multiple areas there was a dissident 2%, 5% who was saying this is terrible. The
Yeah.
impact on kids or the impact on, women in terms of domestic violence. But now they're saying, oh, it ended up being really problematic, but we didn't know.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to sort of send those letters because I didn't want them to be able to say they didn't know. But what do you do anyway? Because you just ignored. So
But
it
there's
doesn't.
no accountability, which is truly astonishing. And I think for those of us in the professions, there's something so shocking about that because we enter into those jobs or fields because we, I guess, rightly or wrongly, want to make a change in the world for the better. And to just see that there's no accountability for power, it's really appalling. So, okay, so let's move into the social impact investing and bonds and so on, because I think that area is so powerful. And I remember when you sent me the email, I said, oh, your work sounds really interesting. Have you heard of Alison McDowell? Because I'd come across her. That's where I learned the word fourth industrial revolution early on. So I was in a group that were talking about her online and found her work, listened to that important early video. She's gone really out there now. She's a very interesting thinker, and she's perhaps in a different field now to she was before. But I also found it compelling. She talked about what we call the NAPLAN and the ways in which that's what got her radicalized as a school mum, the ways in which that was getting used to track children, and then she traced it to Africa and so on. And so you were like, yeah, she really inspired me. So perhaps start there, how you got interested in this, but what's happening in Australia, more importantly.
Yeah. Okay. So I came across Tashi Talks, Tashi Sidford. So she was talking about social impact bonds in Australia. And then I was appalled because of all the work with the welfare and calling out, the impacts that they were having and this generational impacts. Like even if I just use the one example, women who lost their children could not get to court to try to get their children back. So they've got drug and alcohol issue, and then the service closes down, the courts will close down as well. So you're losing children and that's going to, you potentially lost that child, and factor in all the other stresses that were being put on people. So you're looking at generational trauma that's been created through the COVID that was not reckoned with. To find out that there was actual markets being created, and they're being created big time in Australia right now, where private interests can make money off people's vulnerability and their situations, their vulnerable situation. And it's now a for-profit model. I was like being hit by 10. I'd never heard about it, even though I'd been in the welfare industry for 20 years. I would have always thought privatizing the welfare industry is horrendous.
Mm.
Should not do that.
Right.
You should
But it's beyond that, isn't it? In that they privatise childcare or they privatised utilities. I think what's so egregious and morally bankrupt about this, and actually the word is evil, isn't it? What is so evil about this is that and you can explain it better than me, but it's masquerading as assistance. It's the creation of the problems themselves, i.e. through COVID policies as one example, as maybe the key one. And then the masquerade of a solution where it's primarily about data collection. So can you talk about that? Because that won't make sense to most people. So can you explain
I can. So social impact bonds are where, basically before you'd have the government and they would give the non-government organisation like the neighbourhood centre or the community centre or whatever else, they would give it money to run programs. And then they'd run programs with people, local communities, or young people in trouble with the law, or, different aspects, different things, domestic violence to help women leave domestic violence situations. So you've just got government and you've got non-government organisation and workers. And that was that's pretty much still the main model. Now it is these sort of private interests come up with, like, Twiggy, he's heavily invested in this, Andrew Forrest. So they'll come up with a justification. We need to intervene early on this certain cohort of people, like, young Aboriginal people, or, like anything, that people that might become homeless. If we don't intervene on these people, they're going to cost the government this many millions of dollars into the future. So then they're the ones who sort of, and the universities are involved, and they do the sort of the template or this plan. We need to do this sort of intervention on this sort of cohort of people. the government puts forward. So then there's private interests now coming together under sort of organisations, Social Ventures Australia. There's another one that I'm escaping my mind, but there's quite a few popping up. And they will collect money from private finances, private individuals, and they'll say, we're going to put money and funnel it into this program and help these young people at risk, say. So the government, I'm not quite sure how that works with the government, but what ends up happening is that money is funneled through a program. So the non-government organisation now accepts money from private interests. They run the program. They collect extensive data surveillance. It's extensive, much more than what's originally been collected on these people.
So can I intervene and just ask you, is that on the reference group, like say the homeless people or the drug and alcohol users? Is that who they're collecting data on? The reference group?
Yeah.
Okay.
They'll collect it on a certain, so it'll be out-of-home care, kids in foster care who are run through a certain program.
Got it.
And so then they'll be collecting an intensive, or kids who are leaving foster care at 18 and need another year or so in a sort of assisted hotel with wraparound services. So that's another social impact bond, a social impact bond one that's been set up. There's a number of them. I'd have to remember them from the top of my head. But so then once they've collected that data and then they're saying, okay, we've had this much improvement in these young people's lives, the people who originally made the investment get up to maybe 10% a year return. So somewhere between 8 to 10, 12% a year return based on the outcomes. So it's also called outcome something. So the outcomes are the data. You've got to prove that you've had this certain outcome. So then you get a certain percentage of your investment, interest on your investment. And the program might run for 5 to 7 years, say. And so you're getting private interests involved in there who are making financial returns. And this is the impact market. So it's not just that the government goes, okay, this would be a good program to fund and they fund the workers straight away,
Yeah.
They talk about the social impact to try and sell this and sweeten the deal. It's like, well, we don't get paid back if it doesn't work, if the program doesn't work, but they do. There's generally a guarantee that they'll get, their investment back.
Who's they?
Well, it's so that
Mm-hmm.
the private interest. So it'll go through a company like Social Ventures Australia, and they collect the money and then they funnel it through. I haven't looked at it, so this sort of area of it for a little while, so I'm not completely all over the structures. It's all being set up at the moment by Treasurer Chalmers. He's investing a lot of money in the Social Outcomes Fund, I think it's called. So we're looking at where a few programs have been trialled in Australia up till now, and now Treasurer Chalmers at the beginning of beginning of this year, put out a paper, a thesis, basically talking about we have to measure what matters, and it's democracy after the crisis. So it's called this democracy. It's a new form of democracy, and it's a new form of social contract, really.
Yeah.
It's very much so. You've got all these philanthropy organisations. If you look in Australia and start to dig, and I've done articles on it on my Substack.
I'll link to them. Yeah.
Yeah. The amount of philanthropic organisations that are set up that are in this social investment, because not only do you have this, it's also in regenerative agriculture.
Yeah, I was depressed to hear that.
It's in social cohesion. So it's in democracy. Like there's quite a number of democracy sort of fronts that are social impact bonds, philanthropic organisations. You've got the global investment, something network, GIN. So you've got, Bill Gates, and this is globally, United Nations connected, Rockefeller, and then you've got Andrew Forrest. You've got a number of Australian players in there. So this is it's a new form of democracy. It's like now you've got the impactors and the impacted. And when you scratch the surface with these impact organisations in Australia, and I'm sure it's overseas as well, it's a lot of billionaire kids, doing good.
Okay. Yeah, right. Interesting.
Yeah. And then they sit on, some of these organisations sit on the investment roundtable with Treasurer Chalmers. It's very much a way of, we're going to shape policy. They talk about we're going to shape policy. We're going to shape government policy. We're going to impact for good. and we're going to funnel our money in that way. And then we're philanthropists, even though they make a profit return. And there's all these ways that you don't get taxed because you're channeling your money into philanthropy arm, and then you get a profit return off that. So this way of.
So they actually reduce their contribution to society, the taxes that come from the wealthy bracket. Yeah, while making money off troubles. Yeah. And I wonder then, Kate, to what extent does this create perverse incentives? It's like I see that in the mental health field. There's perverse incentives to diagnose people. So is this happening there too?
Yeah, well, there's one paper, it's about schooling.
Mm-hmm.
So it's, because the future of schooling is going to be very much, just teachers are going to have alerts. Like, kids are so hooked up online that they're just alerts are sent out that this child needs intervention. So, and then the algorithms say, based on AI will tell the teacher how they need to intervene. So we're getting more and more into this evidence-based, this is what, you need to do A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D.
Yeah.
But no, it's definitely perverse. It's not right that there's a whole bunch of philanthropic billionaires who think they can dictate what government policy should be, and how the ordinary folk, as they call them, they say folk a lot, the ordinary folk need to be intervened upon. And the World Health Organization put out a paper, I think it was last year. They want to do it like mental health on babies. Start assessing mental health. Yeah, babies' mental health. So we're talking about people being seen as a risk. If you want to talk about the risk landscape, it's like, we don't intervene early on this child, pre-birth. They even talk about pre-birth, that interventions need to start on this individual child that's sort of going to turn out like this because of their parents, their parents' outcomes. If we don't intervene, they're going to be such a risk. So we have to intervene early. I think it's incredibly dangerous. At the moment, they're doing a project called Gen V in Victoria, and I think it's Murdoch Children's Hospital. They're taking every child that was born, every baby in the last couple of years, they have gone to the parents and said, will you be part of this Gen V project? Now, this Gen V project takes DNA from the baby, DNA from the mother. It looks at the mothers and the fathers, if they'll agree, looks at, their academic records, their social records, their any physical health stuff. Then it starts to collect everything on that child, how well they're doing. It's, up to school, but everything, preschool, childcare, their health, and it's got their DNA. So they're looking at the links between DNA and children's outcomes. Social impact bonds, Paul Ramsey Foundation, that's the one. They have funded that. They're the massive social impact bond company in Australia. So they're funding
intrusive research. I mean, it wouldn't pass any ethics committee. I mean, now there are no ethics, but it's beyond research. I mean, you're in welfare, I was in sociology. I've done a research project on mothers. It's not just asking questions. It's so deeply personal and intimate. And then it's for the purposes of profit. So it's a different, it's a lab rats.
And, how much is this eugenics?
Exactly. Yeah.
How much is this going to go into eugenics and interventions on babies? They talk about CRISPRing babies, genetically editing babies.
Yes.
All they need to do is sort of show some link that they can prove between a mental health diagnoses and illness and your genetic structure, and then you're too much of a risk to society to be allowed to just, grow naturally and normally.
Well, that's the key, isn't it? That no one's allowed to grow naturally and normally if this model takes hold, which is why it's so urgent that we push back against it, because it seems to be fundamentally against growing naturally and normally, without being surveilled. And it's partly, it seems to me, about profit. Like I remember Whitney Webb used the term philanthrocapitalist. So it's partly about this sort of new field of philanthropy that's actually capitalism. But it also seems to be about, I mean, I'm interested in the underlying kind of epistemology and ontology, this desire to constantly perfect the human being and screen for every possible risk. And the irony is that it's creating all of those problems. It's not really an irony once you understand philanthrocapitalism. It's part of it's actually part of the program. But for the do-gooders involved, which is many of our colleagues, let's say, or former friends or whatever, It's like, this is helping domestic violence, or this is helping kids that are at risk of recidivism, or, this idea of those do-gooder. It's obnoxious. It's harder to identify.
It's really, and then so Japan's got, what is it called? Democracy. Oh, I can't remember the name of the program, the government. And the G20, including Scott Morrison, signed off on this and said, this is a great idea. And when you look at, I wish I could remember it. Sorry, I can't remember the name of the program. When you look at it, they're talking about things like having robots in houses to be able to pick up if there's any child abuse and send out alerts. It's, where do you stop? Like, where do you stop that we want no child in the world to ever be abused. Okay, we're going to have complete 100% surveillance on every single family to be able to do that. Like,
which is bigger child abuse than anything, up to maybe incest or something, but that the parents are doing. I mean, the level of destruction of the parent-child relationship too, or even the assumption that people should be perfect. No parent has never yelled at their child. It's just absurd.
Exactly. And that's what I was always taught through the psychotherapy. It was the good enough parent. It's, studied Winnicott a lot. It was just that people have to find their own style of parenting that's really authentic to them. And that's
Absolutely.
because that's what you can help people do. You can assist with that. You get out of the way. You don't intervene. The intervention can be so destructive. And you see that, I saw that more and more as I worked in welfare, how people want to intervene. When I was working in my last job in foster care, and it was meant to be therapeutic. And you've got a bunch of young people sitting around talking about what words people should say as foster care parents. You shouldn't say that word. You should say this word. I mean, that's what's actually being seen as therapeutic now.
Very fascinating. It's so absurd. Yeah.
And all it's doing is undermining anything. The most beneficial way to help a family or to be around a family is that people do. They find their genuine way of having a relationship with their own child, and you do not intervene around a mother and a baby. You're very careful. You're very sensitive around how you come into a mother and a father's and a baby's life.
Absolutely.
Absolutely disrupt it.
And then it's generational trauma, like you said before, which is a big part of what the welfare industry does, and the side professions as well. I mean, the best way, as you've said, is to create the container of trust within which to support that family, nothing more.
Yeah.
And that's about what's invited in. But I think because this is about turning that family into raw material, and I find the work on the internet that Shoshana Zuboff did is very powerful. And she said, I mean, it's why I ended up going on Facebook and off a lot of that stuff, which has its own problems too, actually. But what she said, when the product is free, you are the product. And I found that very powerful. Like, in the end, all this social media, it's all free, just hop on, but you are then being surveilled. And it seems very similar. Like, they are the product now. It's not the old model, like you say, where you're either given a grant or given income or a service that is, in the neighborhood house, or, that local therapy service or welfare service. It's something altogether different. That's what I was asking you, because it's actually very hard to wrap your head around, even when you work in the space like you do and I do in an adjunct way as a psychotherapist. It's hard to get your head around. And I've been interested in that shift to everything, telehealth, teletherapy, and that all happened with COVID, didn't it?
Yep.
So that now actually speaking to a human being, which is the core of therapeutic work, again, that containment and that personal relationship, is getting harder and harder.
Yeah,
but people to access, it's gotten more difficult.
That's what they say all the time. Oh, this, COVID sped up the digital revolution, as though that's a really good thing. There's a lot of it's set us off on a trajectory that's just not getting analysed in any way, shape or form. The lack of, if we talk about social impact bonds, there's so little public dialogue about this. It's insane for something so fundamental and so massive, such a massive shift that this is going. And it looks like their non-government organisations are just getting on board with it, which, is there no, I just can't believe it, that the unions aren't pushing back.
Yeah, because we can't vote them in or out, which is something that I came to when I went on my big deep dive of what the hell is going on in parallel to yours. we can't vote these people out, and that's what's so disturbing. One of the talks I listened to of yours, you were talking about, I can't remember the name, Community for Sydney or something, but that they had essentially written the government report, a couple of years earlier. They just got everything, and they're funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and all these other, massive global corporations. And so essentially our governments are having their policies dictated to them. And that's quite disturbing, because it means that the ordinary checks and balances on power are no longer in operation. And whatever we think of as democracy is not what's happening, which is what you said before. There's this revised social contract and a new definition of democracy. Actually, it'd be good for you to define how you see that. Like, what is the new definition of democracy in this kind of managed world of social impact
Yeah,
finance?
look, what is it? It's definitely like you've got the interveners and the intervened upon. You've got, I
Mm.
agree with you 100%, like in everything I've been looking at. So I've looked at about 5 or 6 different angles in the last 3 years. Nothing is organically coming from our government. It is United Nations documents being just tweaked and changed a bit.
Mm.
You've got what you're talking about. You've got resilient Sydney, resilient Melbourne. Um, that's all funded by Rockefeller. That's where all this climate change, resilience, managed retreat stuff is coming down from, or one component. I'm not saying it's just one thing. And then they're just writing papers with the Committee for Sydney. You've just got these massive, huge global actors in the mix. And it's very transparent that they're writing the papers and they've got all the councils on board. And there's no question about it that this is an ethical way. What we need to keep an eye on whatever solutions they come up with and what's going to be the asset transfer.
Mhm, mhm.
Also, an
Yeah.
asset transfer. It's very blatant. The private interests are getting more, the stakeholder capitalism model from the World Economic Forum and others, that now stakeholders and big business needs to be involved intrinsically in making policy and making decisions, because somehow big business is going to save us now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's really bizarre. It's really bizarre how all of this has happened. And there's been this massive flip, because people used to be concerned, or the left used to be concerned about massive corporate interests being involved in government and having too much sway. But somehow, when you put it under a social impact banner, it's okay.
Well, I think the left have been completely usurped and co-opted by neoliberal careerism. So because they've got their good salary and their status from their job, and they've lost whatever the left had before. They're institutionalized and they've been co-opted through careerism. That's my conclusion.
Yeah.
I mean, there are a sort of rogue few of us who resist that or find creative ways to still have a career, which often means having far less salary. That's the truth of it. It's not spoken about, but that's the truth of it. But I think they've just co-opted. So it doesn't make sense, but I think it does when you look at it through that lens, which is really just sort of ego, because it's right against what the left stood for in terms of vulnerable cohorts, in terms of the exploitation of natural resources, up to and including our consciousness and being and well-being. And I think that's also, just to digress for a minute, what people find so hard to wrap their heads around is that abstract things like consciousness or well-being or an internal sense of mental health, I hate that language, but is now what is being commodified. So what I learned from Zuboff, and I think your work really demonstrates very well, and other people like Whitney Webb, and there's a few people working in this space, but is that abstract things like the human psyche is being monetized while under the pretense of quote unquote health. And I think this could be a good segue into managed retreat, because nature itself now is also being monetized, but not in the usual way, like let's log that forest and sell the logs, but in this other bizarre way that, again, you're talking about, Whitney Webb's talking about, and others are talking about, where the value of the forest, which includes every last item in it, down to, I don't know, the fungi and the moss, is valued and sold as a value, as a data point. Actually, can you just elaborate? Because I don't really get my head around that.
Yeah, and that's just before I go into that, the well-being. So we now have the well-being budget in Australia. So this is really alarming with the social impact bond structure. Just to before I get off it, is that what is well-being? Who decides what your child's well-being is? It's
Yeah.
government now, and it's the social impact investors are going to decide what your child's well-being needs to look like. That is such an overstep, and this is happening with, again, very little public discourse. I've been trying to raise the social impact bonds structure and the repercussions of this for a good couple of years, and it doesn't get any traction because there's something I don't know. It's hard for people to wrap their head around. It doesn't sound bad. It's sort of like well-being, like it is. There's something about it that people can't grasp, and I'm not quite sure like what that is. So yeah, but I keep saying, like, I really want parents to be alert to it. And the wellbeing surveys that are being rolled out in schools every single week, kids are being asked to list from 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. What's your wellbeing on certain, how happy are you with the things you have at home? How happy are you with a number of different things, and that they being compared. So the data's already been collected to be able to create these markets off the children. And I've been trying to raise awareness. That's what's happening. It comes down from the OECD. The OECD has wellbeing, and I've got all this documented, but the OECD has wellbeing papers, and they say explicitly in there, parents affect children's wellbeing and they need to be monitored. It explicitly states it in their documents. So they need to monitor what's the state of the parents' relationship with each other, the wider networks that the parents are involved in. There are lots of different aspects they're talking about monitoring. So I would love parents to, especially when they've got children at school, to actually take their kids out of these surveys.
Oh, yeah, it's a little nightmare. And most people don't even know they're happening. Like I don't. I've got kids in school. Are they happening in Victoria? Or is it just New South Wales?
No, I'd say it's happening in Victoria. There'd be some sort of wellbeing metrics being collected at school, or if not, it will be soon. It's in New South Wales for sure.
There's lots of invitations for children to be in studies because I say no to all of them. And many people, again, think it's an opportunity. Like there's one about, environmentalism and environmental anxiety, and I see through. And also they act like it's optional. But when you say no, I've found multiple teachers then say, oh, why? And it's connected to an excursion that's fun and that the friends are going on. So it's quite nefarious in that opting out is getting harder and harder. It's framed that it's a choice, but it's not really. And I think that, it's just ushered along, and trying to say no turns you into a contrarian rather than just no is it one legitimate option. Like what happened with vaccination. No was supposed to be one legitimate option, but then it's just suddenly not. And we see this in the gender space too. So that is also another revision in this revising of the social contract, I think, that you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, and I think you're exactly 100% correct. They are commodifying things. I think at the core of it, they're commodifying things that they could not commodify previously. So they get into nature and the ecosystem services. It's a breakdown of nature as it creates this sort of service. So this much nature and this combination of nature makes this much fresh air. This many bees in an area creates this much pollination service. So you're breaking it down to like this, and again, it's really hard for me to wrap my head around. I just don't think this way. You're breaking things down to fundamental levels and putting a price point on it. And then so the argument's been, if we don't do that, it'll never get valued. So when they're going to develop something, or when they're going to
That's the rationale.
Yeah, the rationale is if there's no financial number put on this amount of nature, it will never be seen as important. So we have to find out. That's how I think it's been argued for. Because I think this is nothing new. Like you're coming across this stuff, but it's been around and it's been talked about for, decades.
Yeah, decades. Yeah.
You're just completely unaware of it. So Rockefeller at the end of last year, I think it was, made a bid with the Interdevelopment Bank to put these ecosystem services on the stock market so they can start to be traded. Yeah. It didn't go through at the time, but this is what is happening in Australia as well. CSIRO is involved in this. So you start to trade in these ecosystem services. And when you get into managed retreat,
Hang on. Can I pull you up, Kate, and can you describe that for listeners? So Is it that there's a database? Like, is that managed through the CSIRO or the government or someone
Yeah.
else? Like, I just discovered Victorian titles are privatised to land data. Is there a private database that then is mapping all of our forests and surveilling them, or what, or the sky?
Yeah,
or
there is, but I cannot remember what it's called. So there is a
Doesn't
database.
matter, but
I think
okay,
I'd have to go back and relook at it. It's been a couple of months since I've had a look at it.
I'll put it in the notes. Yeah.
So basically, and I'm not saying I'm all over this. All these areas are really complex, but
Yeah.
every company with the ESG scoring and the environmental scoring, they're going to have to account for, any environmental impacts on their products or anything that they use. So this is where that ecosystem services has to be broken down as well, so you can report on it. So that's another. All of this is being built at the moment. It's really just starting to happen.
Yeah,
And
by that you mean the policy is being built or the
Yeah.
infrastructure.
Yeah.
But like companies, 20 years ago had to report on how many women were on the board versus,
Scoring,
pay for women. And then they'd say, where is your score on gender equality? No one talks
Yeah.
about the fact that women were exhausted and might have wanted to be with their babies because that's not part of the metric. So what you're saying is that there's now a metric being devised of how corporations are meeting environmental thresholds. But what about nature itself? Like, how is that being turned into something, if you know? Like,
Yeah,
what is
so
it being turned into as opposed to the log that can make a toothpick or that can make a house?
Yeah.
Being turned into something else. A digital twin of nature is emerging, yeah? To use Alison McDowell's language.
Yeah. Yeah. So they call it blue and green infrastructure. So nature has become infrastructure. So in the Infrastructure Australia report, the government report, they call it blue and green infrastructure. So nature is infrastructure to stop climate change or to mitigate climate change impacts. So there's going to be more and more money funneled through into nature, but there'll be some level of ownership over that nature. So say there's the government reports are coming out, and I don't know about Victoria, but New South Wales, and then there's federal as well. There's going to be, because they're using wide, so there's going to be a widespread managed retreat policy come out in New South Wales next year. Now, managed retreat is where you move people and houses and infrastructure away from certain areas based on climate change modelling.
Yeah, like the people in the floods recently in New South Wales, they're talking about moving them. Yeah.
This is going to be preemptive.
So
we're not
time.
Yeah, it's going to be preemptive based on the IPCC pathway 8.5. So the most extreme climate change modelling for where we will be in another 100 years or 80 years, they're going to preemptively start moving people based on that. So what they'll then do is they talk about in the documents, we can get private interests to help move people, and then they can have the land in return. They will do things like, I imagine,
private interest will have the land.
Yeah, that's in the New South Wales government document.
How are the people compensated for the loss of their private?
Don't know how they're going to be. There's a lot of talk about people's properties need to go down based on, the property prices need to go down based on climate change. There's a number of calls for that. This is all global as well.
Yes.
This is all coming from the United Nations and their Sendai framework and different reports. There'd be a lot that's gone on for a very long time. They say that, I think it's like one report was like 3 billion people are going to be moved due to climate change in the future. So we're not talking about a small amount. So yeah, private interests are going to get themselves more and more embedded in that land that people are moved off from. And a New South Wales Reconstruction Act was passed in 2022 for New South Wales, where the minister, I think it looks like there's two men who are the ministers for this area, could call an emergency preemptively and say people can no longer live in this area. So there's a number of issues here, and I'll come back to the land stuff. We've also got the local councils are broke, state governments are broke. Larry Fink from BlackRock's just bought Global Infrastructure Partnerships from memory. They're explicitly saying governments are broke. They can no longer afford to fund infrastructure. So you know how they wrecked the economy, forced themselves broke through COVID. We can see where this is heading. So governments are broke. private interests are going to start taking over more and more of the infrastructure. So you've got just the normal roads and sewerage and normal.
Yeah, the utilities are all sold off. Elon Musk comes in and give us, Starlink, we're all grateful, and yet it sets a precedent about how this is done. Mm.
And then you've got all the digital infrastructure that needs to be put in so we can live in smart, risk-free cognitive cities that send out alerts when, the air temperature does something and the climate,
Funny how that was Black Mirror. That was fiction like 2 years ago, and now it's like literally in government documents. Let's move towards this model.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So you've got all of that coming in. So the question to me, I don't know how exactly this is going to look, and it's going to take a while, but if where they want to take it. But if infrastructure companies it's privatized, they're the ones, and this actually says in the committee for Sydney, infrastructure companies are the ones who can call, we no longer want to keep infrastructure up to a certain area. It's not worth it. We can't afford to do it. I mean, they need all the digital infrastructure as well. So we're not just talking about basic infrastructure. So I see a whole bunch of stuff here, but in New South Wales, it's going to come out in local council next year as to how they're going to mitigate climate change through New South Wales and through the council areas. So this is going to heat up big time. This is going to be full on how this is. Now, part of the natural asset stuff is I imagine that private interests will be able to regenerate the land under, and be able to cost it according to natural assets.
They'll improve the value according to that metric,
I reckon.
while devaluing it for people's private property so that and also the other thing that I find interesting, at least in the words you're using, which I'm assuming come from their documents, 3 billion people are going to be moved, not may negotiate to move, may choose to stay, may, there's not this, in a democracy, that's a negotiated process. And people, people could choose to stay in a bushfire or leave. The recommendation is leave, but you can choose to defend your property. It's sounding more and more like it's just a fait accompli that you're going and you'll be told to go by a government service. And, as what happened with the floods in the US, people who were actually quite resourceful were told to stop by FEMA, while some people were not accessing water, or, that those guys who were flying the helicopters were told that they were breaking the law. In other words, there's less and less capacity for independent choices or actions.
Yep, absolutely. There's less capacity, and there's a lot of philanthropists in the disaster space as well.
Oh, of course.
So when the floods happened in Lismore, when was that? 3 years ago, 3 years ago?
Yeah.
I was talking to a guy up there in Byron, and he set up like a community kitchen, and in a sort of neighborhood center or a community center, and he was shoved out by a global philanthropic group. They came in and shoved him out, and then started to do their global food kitchen for disasters.
Which, yes, you needed like a digital path to access. And then there was a survey at the end. And, this is the other piece of all this, isn't it? It's like what you're saying about people being moved off their land and having that nature becomes commodified, but then our access to it becomes conditional. In a way, it's not, when we're independent, sovereign beings with a relationship to the land.
And then they're talking about social cohesion and nature. So I think they're going to start valuing, your private park, like not private park, your community park, and how much and then making a dollar value on how much socially cohesion that gives you, because they talk about this with social cohesion. The philanthropists are in there with social cohesion as well. And if you don't live in a socially cohesive society, according to the government document, Strengthening Democracy, you're a threat to democracy, basically. If you don't trust the government, it leads to lack of social cohesion, and then you're a threat to democracy. So it's basically they're going to start valuing the social cohesion component of your local park and putting a dollar value on that as well. So they're going to create a whole market around this. Now, the market, I'm not 100% sure how that market's going to look, but this is what they're doing. They're commodifying every component of nature, every component of social interactions. It's all going to be, surveilled and commodified. It's basically, I don't think you can commodify anything more than what they're talking about commodifying. the whole other massive thing with this managed retreat that I think it needs to be on people's radar is that Australia is now going to be a critical mineral superpower for the fourth industrial revolution. Australia is going to be mined extensively for critical minerals to power this fourth industrial revolution. So it's in the government documents, and we've got a partnership with the United States to supply their military with critical minerals. And I guess that all the net zero people are going to get caught in that, like, oh, it's okay to mine for that, but it's not. And there's a
that's got carbon offset or something.
Yeah, it's got carbon offset, or it's
under gunpoint.
Yeah. So I think this whole people being moved off the land as well in the future, I would love people to have in their mind how much is this potentially connected to mining. But I don't believe them. I don't believe what they're saying about even the nature stuff and how we've got to look after nature. If you read a lot of the documents and everything, there's a massive push to saying that synthetic is better for the climate and the environment than natural. So they're talking about genetically editing animals, endangered species. Like, we're looking at a massive eugenics project in the works.
Well, like everything, I mean, it's inversion. And so it comes in on this white horse of protecting nature, or like the misinformation bill or the social media, protecting children. They brought the social media in. They want people addicted, and then they pretend that they're now protecting. It's a motherhood issue that you can't dispute. Otherwise, you're awful and a bigot and you want children to be addicted to social media, which of course we don't. We're mothers. We don't. But we don't want that bill coming in telling people what they can do. Give it back to the parents. And, but it's a similar thing, isn't it? It's like we're protecting nature, but actually what's happening is in philanthropic capitalism, it's the commodification of nature to sell on the market as a digital twin. And then, when I was thinking about what you said about the park, if you're considered a risk based on your lack of social cohesion and the park represents cohesion, then your social credit score is quite possibly impacted by how often you go to the park and who you associate with at the park and the way in which you use the park and talk about the park to your friend in your text message or whatever. It's all integrated, isn't it? Because that's the kind of so-called Internet of Things. So there's an interaction there too, isn't there? And both parts of that, the natural and the social, are being objectified, quantified, sold, and in part for the purpose of surveillance and in part for the purposes of profit. But it seems that the physical, natural world has exhausted itself, which is something Derek Jensen talks about quite powerfully. It's like there's nothing more to steal, rape, pillage, commodify in nature, which is what real environmentalism was about, the protection of wilderness and animals and nature. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to digital twin everything and commodify that, which requires massive intrusions in privacy and also the mapping of nature. And we've all been doing that, like good little minions with global, with the apps, like recording everywhere we go, or the real estate app, or, I heard something about the Airbnb being the best way that the powers that be have now surveilled the whole world because everyone just commodified their back shed or back room or, myself included. And now all that data is available and you put that together with Google Maps and there's just like right down to the nth. And Zuboff talks about that in her books, that that game, what's it called? Oh, my roots started being the chickens are noisy. She talks about what's it called? It's a Google game, something Go.
Okay.
Anyway, what that led to was it was a geocaching thing, people going into other people's homes without asking and getting things. But what it enabled the app to do was surveil all those yards. So it was kind of intrusive surveillance under the guise of a game. I'll remember the name later. I might link.
Pokemon Go?
Yes, that one. Yeah. And people were like, what are you doing in my backyard or my front yard? And she said, well, the real goal was there to get the data about that yard and about that space and that home and, and so, they seem to go together. But I mean, I think what you're saying is that the infrastructure and the legal framework is being put in place now. Is that right, Kate?
Yeah.
Australia, I mean.
Yeah, and it's crazy, like, that the minister can declare an area in New South Wales as an emergency area, and this is preemptive, it can be post event, but it's also preemptive. For primary or secondary reasons, and then they can take that land, they can do what they want with that land, and they can on-sell that land. Now, that's an enormous amount of power that just went through in 2022 with hardly anyone looking at it.
Well, everyone was looking at the pandemic, weren't they? I mean, it's like a lot of the gender stuff, the bills got passed in 2020 and 2022 that are really punitive around the use of language, about how to practice therapy, about, it's a so-called gender conversion. And that all went in at that time too. So people weren't looking because we were focused on this crisis. Okay, so what are the laws stipulating that have gone through in 2022 about the environment?
Oh, I don't know about the environment. There's a whole bunch. I actually next year I want to look at net zero and really read the government plans around net zero and what are they really proposing. But see, at the moment, so if we just with food and whatever else, they're in the middle of changing the definition of genetically modified to allow a whole bunch of genetically modified food to be in the market and not labeled and not safety tested. So things are happening really, really quickly. It's just being pushed through. They're looking at changing the legislation around that, and then the FSANZ, the Food Standards Body, changing whatever policy they've got to be able to allow that to happen. Yeah, so
They milk this product that they're putting in the milk and the beef.
yeah,
Pronounce it Bovier or something.
yeah. I haven't looked at too much of that, but yeah, that sort of stuff. So the problem's going to be, all this net zero and this synthetic stuff is touted as more sustainable.
Yeah.
Yeah, and has less carbon scoring. So you're going to have more and more like actual natural food. It's got a higher carbon score. And then because the companies will have to, and through the ESG scoring, will have to account for how much carbon they're using or releasing on the farm. And so the metrics and whatever else and how they transport. And so we've got this huge amount of surveillance going through, and then that's going to be scored. So that's probably, I guess that's where I'd like to focus, is to try to get people to understand that this net zero is really nefarious. And and so the environment, I don't know exactly what's been passed in the last couple of years. You can't keep up with it. It's ridiculous, the amount that's being passed every time you turn around. And then to be able to look through an act and to pick out that 1 to 2 sentences that's the issue within the whole act.
That reveals the method. Yeah. And again, net zero, it's like it gallops in on a motherhood issue that seems like a good thing that you can't dispute. I'm conscious we're at an hour and a half, but I thought maybe there was one other point that you made in one of your articles or something that I've read that I thought was interesting and disturbing about managed retreat, and that was the removal of whole streets and whole communities, and then perhaps how that links to the insurance premium issue and the capacity to own private property.
Yeah. Well, they're talking about 1 in 25 houses in Australia uninsurable by 2030. But that's a low number probably because they're going up so much. And then in the government documents and in the Committee for Sydney, they talk about a number of times about we need to move communities together because communities are so important to each other. I mean, this whole synthetic way of using community is really irritating. So we've got to move communities together. So this means, of course, that people are going to have to move into something that's ready to go. If you're going to move it, a couple of hundred people together or 500 or a couple of thousand people together, you're moving them into a smart city sort of complex arena. And then, I imagine that they talk about things like there'll be triggers when managed retreat needs to be called. So, you've got it there sitting there as this will be the fourth option, but if we'll try these other things. So one of them will potentially be something like when a certain amount of percentage of people living in an area can't afford insurance anymore.
It'll be a trigger. Okay.
Cost the government too much if there's an emergency or something happens to that area and all of these people, it's too much of a risk. We'll have to call a managed retreat. I don't know. I'm sure that the incredibly wealthy will still be able to live in coveted areas. So I'm not 100% sure how that's going. Yeah.
Well, it'll probably be if there's no mortgage because you need insurance if you're mortgaged.
Yep.
So it'll be the mortgage free that will potentially, I mean, I don't know, have the option, but
Yep.
you now need insurance for the mortgage. And if you can't afford insurance, I mean, the other piece is that all of those things are getting more expensive, rates as well. And so it already pushes lots of people out who were hanging on, and it makes it impossible for a whole lot of people to come in. And so maybe the only option then is owning outright.
But then you've got to pay a lot for the infrastructure. If you've got a sort of
Yeah.
a certain amount of people, then you still have to be able to afford really high infrastructure costs, I guess. But then the federal government's about to pass, they put out a paper a couple of months ago. So you're also going to have ratings on homes about how energy efficient your house is. And when you go to
Mm.
sell, that will come up, as well as if you want to rent out a part of your house or rent out a property, you're going to have a certain energy rating on your house. So we're looking at upgrades needing to happen for people. Now, Scotland's, this is of course all global. Scotland's saying that's going to be compulsory, that you have to upgrade your house by 2033. Australia's just introducing it. This is for existing builds. So you're going to have maybe a 5-star energy rating, but that will go up all the time. As new products come on the market, you'll be expected to keep upgrading your house. So there's about 5 different components of what they're doing around private property that I've tracked, which are converging at the same time.
Yeah, and it's just so Orwellian. I mean, like you say, people need to know about this because they're just not understanding what's possible. And I think because when words like, climate change and risk and, it elevates fear, but also we're helping us to get to whatever, net zero or environmental sustainability, it's very difficult to track that alongside that is this encroaching totalitarianism. And in fact, it's just a Trojan horse so that can get in the gate. And
Yeah.
once it's in, it's all a bit too late. And it's not actually about nature. Well, that's my view
It
anyway.
is. Net zero is about mining the crap out of Australia.
Yeah.
And bringing in synthetic food and synthetic and CRISPRing and genetically editing and altering everything. And I'm sure there's a whole bunch more awful stuff that's in the works. And then removal of private property.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the big one.
If it's allowed to go to its end game, and then that transfer of wealth over to private interests.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
commodification of nature, and to be able to make money off the ecosystem services of an area.
Yeah.
To own the ecosystem services, to be able to own the ecosystem in that way.
Yeah. And call it a service.
Or
Yeah,
nature service, yeah.
noxious. And it reminds me of when, once I sort of had this epiphany about what all the social media apps were doing between sort of 2018 and 2019 when I went off. I would share it with friends, and many people would say, but I've got nothing to hide. It doesn't matter, as in about privacy. That's separate from how else would I connect with people now, or, this is a key part of my social life. But just saying it didn't matter. And I would say, but it's the principle of the matter, and it's what happens when a society loses the fundamental right to privacy.
Yeah.
But I think this is similar. So what we're talking about is the worst case scenario, but anyone with political nous knows you have to understand power in terms of the worst case scenario. In other words, the power that is transferred to a corporation or a government is the power that can be used. Whether it is used or not is irrelevant, but it likely will be. That's how this stuff works, which is why none of the pandemic bills have been reversed, or none of the states of exception around 9/11 were reversed regarding, the way we go through airports now, or the digital surveillance in travel. So, but it's interesting that a lot of people don't see that, and they would say you and I are fear mongering.
Yep.
And yet the reality is that when you give away that power, it can and likely will be used.
Well, they've got a lot of trust. I mean, I don't think a lot of people are doing their due diligence, which is basically if you're comfortable with it, okay, so you're comfortable with these ideas, you then got to track where it came from, which you can track it back to the United Nations. Then you've got to track which interests are embedded within the United Nations and what are their track records. And, and then you've got to ask yourself, do you fundamentally trust these entities?
Yeah, BlackRock, Amazon.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Do you trust them? Do you trust the Rockefeller, foundations? Do you trust, and then why? And so this is, like, I don't think these guys are playing. I don't think they're playing around. So if these policies are coming in, legislation sitting there, it's not a game.
No, absolutely not. And that's why I think concurrent to this, all the censorship laws and misinformation bills are being put forward so that any discussion that could be had gets marginalized completely. And that, I think, just to tie this up, is why we're in a cul-de-sac. Like, no one's listening. And you're like, well, hang on, I've done all this work. And you have, and your work is so diligent and thoughtful and comprehensive, Kate. It really is. And yet, if I can't find it, like, I mean, and I'm in the same space as you, I just think that we're getting marginalized and we're in a little cul-de-sac, those of us who are critical, and anyone with a voice isn't being amplified or engaged with. So, there's ABC articles, because I looked up a few when I was looking at this managed retreat about insurance. It's going to be harder to get insurance, but no question about whether you can opt out of insurance, what the insurance companies are, invested in or promoting. But where's the voice like you being invited in to speak on that? It's not happening. It's like food, it's like so many areas, like the vaccines, like health, like, environment. And so I think, we're going to have to accept, which is part of what I guess I came to when I wrote my paradigm shift article, that we're in a radical minority and that we hold dissident views that are no longer in step with the dominant culture. And not just, like, I'm a different religion of the dominant culture. I mean, radically right down to the core beliefs and ways of being. Where do you think that goes? And I think maybe we conclude on that. For those of us over here, do you think they'll leave us alone because we're like the Amish and we're just a bit of an oddity?
What they want to have us. I don't know.
We're the control group.
Yeah, we're the control group. I don't know what they're going to do over time. I feel like they need to keep a veneer of democracy over what's going on, so not too many people get too disturbed at one particular point in time.
Mm-hmm.
Don't know, really don't know. It's very disturbing because you start to see how much we're being psyoped all the time, and how, okay, there's this, they've got it, like the ABC articles about managed retreats. So I came across stuff, I think it was about a year ago or beginning of this year, about managed retreats. Started looking at our government documents, found so much in there, but it wasn't being discussed. And now they're normalizing it through the ABC. So they just pull out and they start to normalize stuff. So yeah, it does get really disturbing to see what they're doing and how it's being done. Yeah, I really don't have an answer at the moment. I've spent 3 years really trying to work out what's going on, and it's bigger than Ben-Hur, and it's massive, and there's a lot of plans that have been a long time in the making.
Mm.
And I you just got to keep going with integrity, really. Yeah, just keep going with integrity, and I don't want to pretend. I don't want to. Yeah, just because I don't really know what's happening anymore. I'm kind of like critical. I'm sitting back. I don't trust anything on face value, and I think it's very important that people stop accepting things on face value, even if it's like within the freedom movement.
I agree.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Like, you just need a critical head on your shoulders at the moment, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's sage advice. Okay. So where can people find you, Kate? I'll do links, but is there anywhere you'd like to direct people? Obviously your Substack.
Yeah, just with the Substack at the moment. So it's just Kate Mason Substack. It comes out up with searching, and still haven't got my website up. And I do have YouTube, but most of my Substacks link to my YouTube, so people can go through and find. Mostly I do a video on something that I'm writing about and to try to explain it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, good. And I've got written down here that you're a member of Community Voice Australia as well. Is that something
That
you've
was
done
when
recently?
we sort of ended that. That was a
Oh,
sort of,
okay.
so let's try and band together and call ourselves Community Voice Australia, and we want government transparency and accountability in the community,
Yeah.
seat at the table. But it's just too complex, just really
Yeah.
too complex. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. And I saw that you spoke at Australians for Science and Freedom after we met, after we conversed online. Yeah, so you're a member there too, I guess, which is
Well, yeah, I went in and spoke to them as well. I'm not a member, but I did speak to the committee. Yeah.
yeah, they're having good conversations, I think, and putting this on the agenda.
Yeah.
All right, Kate. Thank you so much for the interview, and I really appreciate your work and I appreciate your time. And let's stay in touch.
Yeah. Thanks, Pete. Thank you.
You're welcome.